All right, this slideshow is to accompany Chapter 8 and to talk about the heart. We've talked about blood vessels. Now we're going to talk about the structure of the human heart and relate that to the blood vessels. And eventually we're going to describe disorders of the heart and the blood vessels. And so that's coming up. So I've got a picture of the Tin Man here. I want to really focus on the structure and function of the human heart. Okay, so the heart is part of the cardiovascular system. This is a network of blood vessels, blood, and the heart, and its function is primarily to transport materials from the different organs to the tissues. The heart pumps blood, and that blood is rich in oxygen, and it carries oxygen to the cells that need it. It removes waste products like carbon dioxide and urea, and other waste products so that they can be disposed of. It'll take them to the kidneys. It transports hormones from glands like the adrenal gland or the thyroid gland to all over the body where they can direct activities of the cells. Anything that needs to be transported is transported by this cardiovascular system. This system is also really crucial for regulating body temperature. Okay, we direct the flow of blood to control the flow of heat. And so blood can be uh, put to the surface of the body to carry temperature so that we can get rid of excess heat. The blood can be restricted and held away from the arms and the legs or the skin to conserve heat. It's also how we get rid of acids because we can transport blood and buffers to different parts of the body. We are transporting things like sodium and potassium ions, crucial for nerve cells, all sorts of things the blood does. And the heart provides the force needed to move blood through the blood vessels. Arteries are going to carry blood moving away from the heart. Veins will carry blood that's moving slowly as it returns to the heart. And those capillaries in the lungs, capillaries in the muscles, capillaries in the organs, are where exchange occurs. And so the heart is actually controlling this and making sure that things go to places they need to go. Okay, and so I think I've had this slide in the other PowerPoint. The heart contracts, and when it contracts, that's referred to as systole. And as the chamber contracts, it gets smaller, and the blood is forced into the vein or to the arteries at that time. And so this is a wave of pressure that's going to be detected in the arteries. That wave of pressure is referred to as systolic pressure when the heart is contracting. And when it's relaxed, pressure drops in the arteries and veins, and that's diastolic pressure. This is strongly affected by things that are happening in the arteries, but the main cause of this is the heart. And the farther you get from the heart, the lower the blood pressure is. And that's why blood sometimes pools in large veins because it's moving so slowly because it's so far from the heart. Okay, let's look at the structure of the heart. The heart is really four chambers: two small upper chambers, the right and left atria, and then two large lower chambers, the right and left ventricles. Okay, here you can see the chambers. The big chambers have a thick muscular wall on the bottom of the heart. The upper chambers are very thin walled and don't have a lot of power. And so these chambers coordinate where the atria contract to force blood into the ventricles, and then the ventricles contract to force blood into the major arteries. Okay, to make sure blood flows in the right direction, the chambers have a valve between them, and the arteries have valves in their bases. This makes sure blood flows in only one direction. It's the sounds we hear when the heart beats, the lub dub that the doctor listens to or the nurse listens to when they listen to your heart, is actually the closing of the valves. And the valves are just little flaps of connective tissue, of collagen, that if blood tries to flow backwards, they will come together to block blood from flowing backwards. And so here you see the right atrium is guarded by a tricuspid valve, and that valve has little string-like chordae tendineae that anchor it to some muscles to make sure the valve doesn't flow backwards. And then when this right ventricle contracts, it forces blood out past this major pulmonary semilunar valve. And blood can easily flow through it, but when it starts to back up, the flaps of this valve will be pushed together. Whoops, will be pushed together, and the blood can't flow backwards. Okay. On the left side of the heart, you have the upper chamber, the left atrium. Again, a large valve, the bicuspid or mitral valve, guarding that opening. That allows blood to pass easily into the ventricle, but doesn't allow it to flow backwards. What's going on there? Oh, hold on. And prevents it from flowing backwards, and then blood will flow out of the ventricle when it contracts through this large aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta. Okay. The major vessels going into the heart are the superior and inferior vena cava. That they lead to the right atrium. Then the pulmonary veins, there's 4 of those. These veins are going to lead to the left atrium. Blood flow then from coming to the right atrium from these vena cava comes from the body. Here this is shown as blue because this blood carries very little oxygen. Then it's pumped, this blood is pumped by the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, and it's going to go to the lungs where it'll get rid of its carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. Then these left and right pulmonary veins shown here, there's actually 4 of them, 2 left and 2 right. These bring oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. Okay, that is shown in red, and that oxygen-rich blood is pumped to the aorta, where it will go to the rest of the body. Okay, heart muscle then is really concentrated in the ventricles, the chamber of the ventricles, because this is where blood has to be pumped a long distance. The atria have very little muscle because they're just pumping blood to the next lower chamber. The heart muscle itself is very unique. It has electrical activity we don't see in other types of muscle. It's self-stimulating. There is a part of the right atrium called the sinoatrial node that starts an electrical impulse that will cause the heart muscle to contract. This doesn't need to be signaled by the nervous system or by any hormone. The heart does it itself, and that's very different from skeletal muscles or smooth muscles. It contracts about 60 times per minute. That electrical activity spreads throughout the 2 atrium so that the atrium beat at the same time. It's delayed a little at the atrioventricular node, and then it spreads throughout the muscle of the ventricle, and the ventricle will contract later, but at both right and left ventricles at the same time. This electrical activity is large. It can easily be measured at the surface of the body by using electrodes that just record electrical activity. This is called an electrocardiogram, the ECG, and it records that electrical activity of these specialized cells. This is called the cardiac conduction system. And so these electrodes can be placed on the arms and legs or around the heart, and they'll record first the electrical activity associated with the atrium. That's called this P wave here. Then there'll be a slight gap while that muscle contracts and the electrical activity is conducted to the ventricles. And then we'll see the electrical activity that's in the ventricles as a QRS complex. And this QRS complex is larger. There's more muscle there, so you see more activity. And that greater activity then leads to a larger deflection on the chart. Then the last part here is the T wave. That's the electrical activity as the system, particularly the ventricles, get ready to go back to normal. And so this typical pattern should show up in everybody's heart. The spacing of these PQRST waves tell us about how long this conduction system takes. It can tell us if there's been a previous heart attack, if there's an interruption into the system, and it's a good way to look at the heart. And so it's one of the first things that a heart specialist will do to make sure things are going well. Okay, so that's the heart. There's this special muscle. There are 4 chambers and 4 valves. The heart provides the force necessary to move blood through the arteries and veins to the places where it can be exchanged with the tissues. I mentioned that the cardiac conduction system allows the system to run kind of independently. It starts its own impulses and its own contractions, and it's in somewhat regulated by itself. The heart can adjust. It has an intrinsic regulation. The faster blood is returning to the heart, this is called venous return, the more the chambers stretch, and that means then the heart pumps more with each contraction, and this is referred to as stroke volume, and it'll also start to contract more vigorously and more quickly. This is kind of an intrinsic regulation because the heart is just responding to how much blood is returning. The heart also does kind of sense what's going on through several other ways. It responds to activity of both the brain, the nervous system, and the hormones, the endocrine system. And so there are specific nerves that can make the heart beat faster, as well as nerves that can slow the heart down. And so there are blood pressure receptors, baroreceptors, in the walls of major arteries, and these send messages to cardiac regulation centers in the brainstem and the medulla. And those, if the heart is working really hard, that center can decide to send parasympathetic impulses, and it'll send them right to the SA node, and that will cause the heart to slow down. Okay, these will release acetylcholine right at the heart, and the heart will slow down. If blood pressure is too low, these sensory nerve fibers will also notify that cardiac regulatory center in the medulla, and it will send sympathetic nerve fibers again to the SA node, but also to other areas of the heart, and they'll release a different chemical. That chemical is epinephrine or norepinephrine, and that will cause the heart to beat faster, stronger and faster. And likewise, epinephrine and norepinephrine can be released by the adrenal gland, okay, in response to stress. Again, this is controlled by parts of the brain, but that hormone then will go into the blood, and it'll affect, again, the heart muscle so that the heart beats faster and stronger. So even though the pace of the heart is set by the SA node, the heart responds to both endocrine and nervous system inputs. Okay, and this just shows one of these little diagrams that I have that show homeostasis. And so this is one variable that's controlled by homeostasis is blood pressure. And so disturbances in blood pressure are going to activate cardioregulatory mechanisms through the brain and through the adrenal gland. And so this shows on the top, it shows what happens if blood pressure increases. And so this can cause that cardioregulatory center to send those parasympathetic activities that slow the heart, and it'll tend to turn down the adrenal gland. And so the heart will slow, and the volume will decrease, and blood pressure will return to normal. If on the bottom half of the chart you get a decrease in blood pressure, the baroreceptors detect that, and the cardioregulatory center in the medulla can increase the stimulation of the adrenal gland and send those sympathetic fibers to the heart. And those sympathetic fibers will release epinephrine, and you'll get the heart rate and stroke volume to increase. Okay, we'll stop there, and next time we'll talk about some of the disorders that affect the blood vessels.